This is Ellen Leahy with the Missoula City County Health Department, and for the next hour I'll be talking about the influenza epidemic of 1918 as it occurred in Missoula, better known these days as the Spanish flu. And I've entitled this talk The Hour of Proof. That phrase was taken from the journals that were kept by the Sisters of Providence at St. Patrick Hospital. And they kept journals throughout their work over there, and they have some very interesting ones about the 1918 flu in which they and everyone else was heavily involved. They referred to it as the hour of proof. My main reason for researching how the 1918 influenza epidemic was experienced in Missoula was that I thought it would be instructive for those of us at the health department, as well as other safety officials, government officials, healthcare providers, and in fact all citizens, as we prepare for what could occur again, and that would be an influenza pandemic. We're all aware of the various types of emergency preparation that we're supposed to be undertaking in our nation, but much of what's been focused on has been issues caused by man. In fact, the 1918 flu was a naturally occurring disaster, and a future influenza pandemic could again be a naturally occurring disaster. So in that regard, it's not different from a hurricane, a tornado, an earthquake, or a flood. Its main difference is that what causes it is communicable, and often when something communicable hits, it's very hard to control its spread, and so it affects the large community differently than a site-specific disaster might. When we look at the 1918 flu and try to take the epidemiological and civil lessons from it, we are not saying that the 1918 flu is predictive, that another flu pandemic would look like this. We don't know that. We've still not understood all the factors that created the 1918 influenza. But there are things about an influenza epidemic or pandemic that would be similar in terms of how it's spread, how it can affect people, and there are lessons in that, even though the times today are different. One of the things to think about when we're talking about the, quote, Spanish influenza pandemic is that that's just a name. An influenza pandemic is an influenza pandemic, and the reason that the 1918 one was called the Spanish influenza epidemic had nothing to do really with the nature of the disease. It had a political origin in that it was first being reported in the newspapers in Spain because they didn't have some of the censorship issues that the countries that were involved in the war had in World War I. We talked today about bird flu. Well, in fact, the Spanish or 1918 influenza pandemic had its origins in an avian bird flu. In fact, it's birds that serve as a natural reservoir for influenza pandemics. But the difference in 1918 that we know today is that that particular influenza virus spread quickly or jumped quickly from the bird population to people. If we go back to looking at the name, whether it's Spanish flu or sometimes it was called Flanders fever or bird flu, it's interesting to know that this particular epidemic probably started in 1918 right in Kansas. So we could just as easily rename it the Kansas flu. One of the things I think we all need to understand when we talk about pandemic, it's such an alarming term, and of course when pandemics hit, they do go around the world, but what we are really concerned about is that when you have a pandemic, what's at the crux of that problem is that you have a novel virus, something that's very new to the entire human population's immune system. And so people are much more susceptible to it. They don't have any past exposure, past immunities. It tends to be more virulent. And then, of course, it's contagious. It can spread around the world more readily. That's really what pandemic refers to, is that you're dealing with a novel virus. Since the 1918 flu started with the avian population and jumped rather quickly without a lot of mutation into the human population was particularly susceptible to that. That is a worst case scenario type of flu. What we're trying to prepare for in Missoula is certainly something as bad as the 1918, but also make our plans scalable so that a lesser flu and a lesser pandemic we would also be able to identify and respond to. So let's look for a minute at the way different pandemics have manifested themselves in this country over the last century. If you look at the green wavy line that looks almost like a sloppy W, that's the 1918 flu. And we're looking at the number of deaths it caused according to age groups. When you look at the other different colored lines on this graph, those are other pandemics, 1892, 1936, 1957. The first thing we see is two of the other pandemics, other than the 1918 flu, killed a lot less people per 100,000 in the population. And we also see that the flus other than the green 1918 had more of a loose U shape. What was particularly devastating in the 1918 flu is it killed folks that were in the prime of their life that were otherwise immunologically the healthiest among the population. For example, you can see that all the flus have high death rates in the lower age group, 0 to 5, sometimes up to 0 to 10. You can also see to the right of the graph that influenza pandemics, and in fact seasonal influenza, has a higher mortality rate for those in their elderly years, ages 70 and above. But when you look at the green 1918 influenza pandemic, you can see that where it hit hardest in its mortality was those between ages 20 and 40. In fact, half of the people in the United States that died of the 1918 influenza were in those age groups. So that's real striking. And it also had a lot of implications for response to the flu. Those were the folks that, are running the utilities. They're the folks that need to earn wages for families. They're the folks taking care of children and elderly. They're the healthcare providers. And since it was the 1918 flu, that was the same age group that was serving in the war effort across the sea or at home. The main thing to think about in planning, though, is that the pandemic and the way it hits can be quite unpredictable. So once again, we want to prepare for the worst, but we want to be able to scale our response so that we can see how any particular flu is hitting. One of the reasons that the 1918 flu hit Montana as hard as it did, and it did hit Montana very hard, was because Montana was very much in a developmental mode, and much of its population was in the 20 to 40 year age group. So it was particularly difficult for Montanans. The 1918 flu was so hard-hitting, in fact, across the country and across the world, that if we look at this line of life expectancy and we see how it has increased in the 1900s in our country, we see that our life expectancy has only gone up and up and up, so we're getting healthier, living longer, and you see a large divot there that points down. That is what the result of the 1918 flu, that its mortality rate, particularly among the 20 to 40-year-olds, was so great that it statistically caused that shape on our graph there. That said, it's the most devastating of all the recorded pandemics. There have been pandemics since then that, again, were less devastating, and there's some you may not even remember. There's the 1968. It caused excess death. It's just none of them are remembered like the 1918. And we also need to keep in mind that there's pandemics that were expected that didn't happen. There was the 1976 swine flu pandemic that was expected. Immunizations were given, and the swine flu pandemic never reached pandemic levels. That said, looking at the 1918 epidemic, historian Alfred Crosby has stated that nothing else, no infection, no war, no famine, has ever killed so many in as short a period of time as the 1918 epidemic. So let's look again look a little closer at how it hit Montana. This is how the counties existed, the county boundaries in 1918, and there were fewer counties than there are today. You can also recognize where Missoula County is. It's a little larger then, geographically, than it was today. And you can see, based on the coloring of this chart, where the highest density of population was. So we can see Silver Bow County in Butte in black. That was the most densely populated county. We can see Cascade County in sort of that middle color green. That was the next most densely populated. Then we have the lighter green. Missoula was one of those. And then you can see the very sparsely pale green counties throughout the rest of the state. Our county was geographically bigger. The city had about 12,000 people, and the county of Missoula had about 24,000 people. Montana had 5,000 plus deaths related to or as a direct result of the 1918 flu epidemic. Montana's mortality rate in that epidemic was the fourth worst of all the states in the nation. And in fact, if you look at it in terms of a percentage of population, 1% of Montana's population, roughly 1%, died as a result of the flu in 1918, which carried into the winter of 1919. To tell you how that might look like in the Missoulian news, or what was called the Daily Missoulian at that time, you might see on an average day maybe 2 obituaries. When the epidemic wasn't in place yet. When the flu hit, the Daily Missoulian on any average day would have 6 obituaries. 4 of those would have been related to flu. What that means is during the time of the epidemic in Montana, the state's death rate tripled. So the worst part of the epidemic, which was October 1918 through December, Montana's death rate tripled because of the influenza. We knew it was coming. All the states in the West knew that it was coming and had reason to believe that the flu was moving our way. It started primarily in the camps, the Army camps. When it first appeared in Montana, it first appeared in Scobie in September, Scobie, Montana. By the time it came to Missoula, however, which was just a few weeks later, we had it in Scobie, Choteau, down in Whitehall, and it was said in the press to be, quote, raging in Libby. So other than the western border, Missoula County was surrounded by flu by the time it actually hit our borders. Here's a picture of Missoula downtown looking from the North Hills in 1922. Just to give us a sense of what Missoula looked like in 1918 when the flu hit. We had 12,668 people, residents of the county, and 12,600 some in the city, 23,000, almost 24,000 in the county. We had 4 hospitals in Missoula, 12 churches, 12 schools, 12 doctors, about 24 nurses, 24 trade unions, and we had 40 saloons. So that was Missoula in 1918. And of course, like every other part of the country, there was a lot of urbanization going on, a lot of industrialization, and even more so in Missoula. We had the railroad here. This is a picture of what we used to know as the Smith Hotel, which has since been knocked down. Back then it was called the Working Man's Hotel, and so these are the gentlemen, young boys and men that lived to work in all the various trades in those trades unions and then frequented those 40 bars. But we also had troop movements, and troop movements coming right through Missoula. We had Fort Missoula, of course, and we had, this is a picture of the train depot in 1917. Actually, it's a documentation of one of the troop movements when a troop from South Dakota came through. What happened across the U.S. also happened in Missoula, and that is the flu would first appear in the troops, primarily in their Army camps, and then it would spill into the neighboring populations. It's real important when looking at any disease that we look at the context and the civil and societal context in which it existed. And at the time the 1918 flu hit, this is a typical page in the Daily Missoulian. This would have been a full page. We only have a half page copied here. And it depicts the support, the public support for the war effort. It was very, very much a time of we will pull together, we are all for the war, we need to support our troops, and we've even heard about the folks who didn't agree with that and some of the social pressures that fell to them when they would dare to voice that they were not in support of the war effort. The sedition laws in the country, as you know from Clem Work's research, much of that started here in Montana. So we had that going on as well. Generally, though, you would see a newspaper that was full of war effort, that was particularly supportive. The editor of the Missoulian, in fact, referred to the flu as something that wasn't in and of itself just dangerous. It was dangerous because it could affect the war effort. So it was commonly referred to as the Hun's ally. People that didn't do what they needed to do in order to stop the spread of the flu were called health slackers, referring to those slackers who didn't show up for the draft. The editor at one point in the Missoulian said, "We do not see the difference between the Germans and the pestilence." So that was very much the context. It was something in the way and threatening the war effort. The paper was also very upbeat, in my opinion. We will beat this just like we'll beat the Huns. Every time the flu slackened off the tiniest bit for even a day, they would come out and say, quote, "The worst is over," end quote, or quote, "We'll see the end of this business in a week," end quote. At one point early in the epidemic, it actually said that the outlook was quite rosy. In part, they didn't really know what was going to hit them, but in part, they also had to know what was going to hit them here because it had already hit the Eastern Front very, very hard. The good news about the coverage at the time, in my opinion, is that when the flu did appear in the valley, it was published. There are communities in which it was not acknowledged in the newspaper, and that level of denial can, of course, lead to not taking precautions, but in the Daily Missoulian published it. On October 7th, a front page story appeared that men from the fort had been on leave in the city on the day before, which was Sunday. So that was leave day, and they were downtown and visiting bars, I assume, and girls and families or whatever on their leave and mixing in with the city. And on Monday morning, many of them appeared with symptoms. The health officer at the time was a physician by the name of Dr. Ritchie. And the first that he did was real common in the time, is he began asserting the no spitting rule. It was a time of TB. It was a time when spitting was considered very, very bad for health, and yet it was still a fairly common practice to spit on the sidewalk. So he marched right up, and they put the no spitting rule into effect. People were familiar with that rule, and the editor of the Daily Missoulian roundly endorsed that rule. So the main point about the reporting, I think, in Missoula is the fact that they reported it at all and right away was good. That said, they still called it, quote, minor, continued to downplay what may be happening or might be coming our way. The Missoulian editor, I think, did a really good job in terms of standing up to those in the community that thought it wasn't right to report, that it was negative, that it would cause people to feel hopeless, that it would make the city look diseased. And in one editorial, well into the episode, the editor said, quote, "We do not see how the suppression of news will drive the influenza germs from Missoula." If I were a journalism teacher, I would think that would be a very good lesson for journalists. How can a community prepare for and deal with and respond to a problem if they can't acknowledge it? So that went really well in the Daily Missoulian, unlike other newspapers. So back to the beginning of the epidemic here, the first thing that happened when disease appeared on camp is that Sister Sebastian, who was one of the nursing instructors of the Sisters of Providence at St. Patrick Hospital, and two of her nursing students went to the fort and they stayed there. They stayed there for a good 10 days to deal with the first onslaught on the at the fort, it was actually an explosion of disease, as you can imagine, a respiratory spread disease in close Army quarters. Lots of volunteers came to help, not only in the fort, but later at the epidemic. Many of them were trained, many of them were untrained, but they came. I don't know how much of this has to do with, we're fighting the war, we have to fight this disease too, how much of it was just community spirit. It's really hard to say, but I can say that lots of civic organizations were already in place at that time, many of them arranged around the war effort. And St. Pat's Hospital was the main and largest hospital at that time. So the sisters went and the students went. Many of them did become ill. None of the nursing students at St. Pat's died of the disease, which is remarkable when I think of the exposure that they had throughout the epidemic. Unfortunately, many other nurses, trained and untrained, doctors, and other caretakers did die. So in the first explosion, we have our Army folks in the hospital out here at Fort Missoula. They used that, of course, as the flu hospital. And of the 400 troops stationed there at the time of the epidemic, a full 150 of them would be stricken with the flu before it was over. Within a week of the first cases, there was a call across the city issued through the Missoulian to help the fort with tents, blankets, doctors, people, everything. They simply were not able to cope with it themselves at the site. One of the first things that happened then that same week, and it happened pretty quickly, which shows, to me, a quick attempt to response and to be as proactive and take precautions here in Missoula, is that the officials of the time put a quasi-quarantine situation in place. They called it the lid. That's what it was called back then. And what the lid meant, when the lid got clamped on the city, is that the theaters could not remain open. Anything that was considered non-essential could not remain open. This is very interesting that they did this as quickly as they did because, of course, that had an immediate impact on business. It had an immediate impact on people's wages and had an immediate impact on people's perception of the risk and their fear. But it was a common practice of the time, and they did do that. The only thing they didn't close of that nature, they closed the schools, the churches, the theaters, just as it shows here. The bars remained open, and it's a very colorful and interesting story here and in Butte and in other places of the country of the bars remaining open during this epidemic. Unfortunately, they would learn that this type of, quote, mass quarantine wasn't going to work for this type of disease and the way that it spread. And that is one of the lessons that comes out of 1918. And we do see reiterated in today's guidance when we try to prepare for influenza pandemic, is that old style of quarantine, there's just certain places people can't go to, will not stop the spread of the disease. It will slow it if it's done carefully and in certain ways, but it won't stop it. To hear it the way the sisters told it, they have what I think are some tragically beautiful words to describe how they saw the epidemic as it exploded in Missoula. And I want to give credit to St. Pat's for keeping these chronicles and for Marianne Farr at the library at St. Pat's for translating these chronicles out of the French. What the sisters Sebastian said is, the epidemic expanded with crushing rapidity, striking left and right, death through consternation everywhere. People simply could not comprehend how big it is. And we have tried to grasp that in our planning. You can talk about numbers and you can show graphs, but I think these words say how quickly people fell. The caretakers, right with them. So at the same time that we would need caretakers to respond to that first explosion in the epidemic, those very same caretakers could be struck ill. The way that it really hit home for me, because I've been reading about this kind of thing for years. It's part of my work, and I have a real interest in public health, primarily how people in society respond to diseases and problems in their communities. So even though I'd been reading about how bad the 1918 flu was and how the communities responded and how fast the people fell and had drawn graphs and pictures and on, it was when I went to the archives over at U of M and saw the communicable disease reports that Health Officer Ritchie regularly kept at that time that I got it. If you look at the top of this page, in the end of it, it's August, September, and October of 1918, communicable diseases are recorded by the health officer. And we see that Nina Hayes, for example, at the top, a 3.5-year-old girl, had scarlet fever. We move down and we see that someone else had pulmonary TB, tuberculosis. We see some typhoid fever. We see chicken pox that's scratched out and it's corrected to be smallpox and more smallpox. And then on October 8th, the day after that first Missoulian article, we see epidemic influenza. And after that, we see ditto marks. And as you open this and look at it for the first time and then continue to turn the pages, this is what we see, is not even ditto marks, just lines. And then after that, the journals don't even have names. They have Dr. So-and-so saw 10 people, Dr. So-and-so saw 20, so on and so forth, before they can get back to using names again. That I gasped when I saw that. That's when I got it, that the planning that we need to do, if we were to be ready for the worst case scenario, which we don't know we'd need to be, but if we were, would have to be so ready to go before the disease hit our local population, because it is stiff, it is very swift, and it is very steep in the way that it strikes. I do want to back up and say that despite what I just showed you in that communicable disease journal, and what you'll hear more about in terms of how the reports of people falling ill and dying appeared in the paper, the bars remained open. They were not under the lid. And the official policy, as stated from the health officer in the city council minutes, is that bar patrons were to, quote, keep on the move, end quote. They could get their drink after work, but they weren't supposed to gather and sit around the bar. Here we have the cases of flu in Missoula, and this is just the city of Missoula now, so among the 12,000 plus people in the city of Missoula, plotted out as people fell ill. And you can see, as I was saying a moment ago, in that first week, each of those bottom hash marks is a week, how swift and how steep that first influx is. In fact, by the second week in Missoula, over 500 cases were reported. 436 of those occurred in the second week, and that is the peak we see on the left side of the chart. Also, by the second week, the deaths began to occur. This flu had a propensity for killing, again, young people. Usually our seasonal flu, if it causes mortality, is usually due to development of pneumonia, which actually occurs after the person has suffered from the flu. This flu not only could kill by virtue of pneumonia, it could actually kill sometimes as quickly and as immediately as the first day a person was stricken with it. So again, quite virulent. We started seeing deaths, 19 deaths in that first week. These are grouped according to how they're related to each other. The first death was with a member of the SATC, that was the Student Army Training Corps. It was just commissioned in October of 1918, and it was the precursor of the ROTC. And there were Student Army Training Corps on campus as well as at the fort. So G.F. Bonowitz was the first recorded death on October 13th. Right after that, we start to see civilian deaths, and a mother and her daughter died within a day of each other. Then we see the Hoffmans. Mr. and Mrs. Hoffman died that first week and left behind an infant. And then we see a child, and then we're back to the SATC. So that's some of the deaths in the first week. It was very difficult, yet the bars stayed open. I do want to expound on that for just a minute, because they began to recognize, the city fathers, that the they couldn't really quarantine this disease, but they couldn't open the city back up, and they hadn't closed the bars in the first place. And so when they saw the death rate, the illness rate, and the death rate that we just saw, what they did, rather than try to close the bars, is they told the police chief and issued a health order that the police chief was to have his officers go out and remove all the bar stools from all the bars so that the patrons could not congregate. And they actually locked them up and had a big front page report on that. It's very interesting to see this kind of disease and this death rate go on, and to see that certain things are left open. I don't say that critically. I think that in today's society we have certain activities that are considered sacred or necessary, maybe to the people in power, or somehow controllable by virtue of trust or knowing those people. And that, case in point, in the 1918 flu was keeping the bars open. The records show that the bars were finally closed on October 23rd. And October 23rd, we are already down on the downslope of that first spike. So too slow of a reaction for that first spike. Another lesson for us is some decisions are going to have to be made extremely quickly. Influenza was generally referred to, even in medical records of the time, as la grippe, the French for it. And the community really was in the grip of the disease very rapidly. As we noted, St. Pat's responded immediately. The sisters who operated St. Joseph's School closed the school not only for quarantine purposes, but they wanted their sisters to participate in nursing care. And so that took place almost immediately. The Northern Pacific Hospital, which is shown here, St. Pat's on the top and the Northern Pacific on the bottom, which then became the General Hospital, which is now today rebuilt and is part of St. Patrick's Hospital, known as the Providence Center. But at the time, the Northern Pacific Hospital operated as a subscription hospital for the railroad workers. It opened its doors to those that weren't subscribers to that service, and ill people were taken there as well. And as we see on the right of our screen, this was a very typical newspaper advertisement at the time. It was actually an order. I mean, this is an order from the War Department ordering that every graduate nurse, so on and so forth, fill out a questionnaire for the Red Cross so that they could be called up not only for the war effort, but to fight the flu. Even though the bars remained open, the churches were closed immediately. It wasn't considered essential or safe enough to even be open for Sunday sermons. I think that was probably very difficult for a lot of people. There's just a few squeaks in the letters to the editor as to whether that really had to happen. For the most part, the newspaper tended to support what the city officials and health officials said needed to happen. So what they started doing was running sermons in the newspaper, and they had a column called Your Pastor Speaks to You Here, and you can read those. You go back to the UM library and you can read what McLean's father had to say, for example, at his church, and all the different sermons at the time. And interestingly enough, in those that I reviewed, they had more to do with the war effort than the influenza issue again. There was actually a flower famine, an article about how there weren't enough flowers for all the funerals at one time, again during the peak of the disease. A practice that was called a sing was prohibited. Sings are related to the church, or sometimes patriotic gatherings where people would get together and sing as an inspirational gathering, and those were prohibited, saying that the boisterous singing would spread germs. There was only one downer article that I found in the Missoulian, and they said that, it in fact was a very dismal and gray day in Missoula, and it did refer to the influenza. But other than that, I didn't see articles that weren't attempting to be uplifting, although when I do compare the reports of the disease with the actual written reports of the disease, I did find the Missoulian to be accurate in that regard. There was one interesting letter to the editor referring to the churches, a citizen by the name of Floyd Bushnell. He said, quote, "On Saturday evenings and Sundays, the saloon attendance far outnumbers that of the churches." So he did take issue with closing the churches and not the bars. The other thing that was a big part of society then and is now is the marketing of different cures to the public. And of course, that's going hot and heavy these days with marketing medicines, both over the counter and now prescription medicines, to citizens directly. Back then, it looked more like this. They were patent medicines. You could go to your drugstore and you could pick up, for example, Tanlac, which was supposed to thicken the blood. And so these same cures that were daily available began to be marketed as cures or ways to deal with the Spanish flu. Another one was Horwich malted milk. It was marketed to keep your children strong and healthy during the flu epidemic. There was a great occupation with relieving constipation for anything that might ail you during that time in our culture. And so the ads for relieving constipation, also there was quite an upswing of those and how they would help you ward off the flu. And finally there was a spray that you were supposed to spray in the back of your throat to kill the germs, called a Hyamel oil spray, that was also marketed. One letter to the editor actually castigated local officials for failing to burn sulfur. Back then, with epidemics, there was a belief that if you purified the air and you burned sulfur in the air, that would get rid of the miasmas or the vapors that cause these types of epidemics. So it was interesting times. There was a vaccine that was developed. There were several vaccines developed, one by the New York City Board of Health, one by a physician by the name of Dr. Rosenau out of Minnesota. And these vaccines, for the most part, were intended to decrease the effects of the influenza and fight off the subsequent pneumonia. The State Health Board, in their guidance, they weren't convinced that it would work, but they were convinced it would do no harm, and so they made it available by saying this will do no harm and it might do good. And I show here the Masonic Temple in Missoula because that's where the health officer of the time, Dr. Ritchie, had his office. So the newspaper said if you want to go get your vaccine, in fact it was a series, you had to get 3, you'd have to go to the Masonic Temple, to Health Officer Ritchie's offices and get it there. There was a great patriotic spin, as I've said earlier, on the influenza. So there were articles about, patriots wear their masks, health slackers do not wear their masks, help the war effort. And this is a picture of a gentleman by the name of A.B. Kimball. He was a renter at 220 Southeast 5th Street, and he was a ticket master for the NP Railroad. And this is a picture of him out front of his rental wearing his mask. Missoula didn't require masks of the general public. Some cities did. But they did require it of people that went from home to home, such as messengers and deliveries boys. And the newspaper gave step-by-step instructions, diagrams, so on and so forth, on how you could make your own mask and masks for your whole family. So despite all these efforts, the flu did continue, and then to make matters worse, about the time that we had 600 cases reported, and so now we're looking at the October 21st, 1918 Daily Missoulian report. And we now have cases at the university. The university students and the SATC at the university then began developing scarlet fever. That's caused by strep, and of course there weren't antibiotics at that time. And so scarlet fever was running through the university scene at the same time influenza was. The university initially did not close when the city put the lid down in early October. They had, I think, even looking at it from these days, some valid concerns about sending students everywhere and traveling as an epidemic was hitting. But they found that they simply couldn't manage all the concerns about the students that were there. And they then said that they were going to close, but that they were doing it preventatively. I think that was a bit of spin. They were saying we're doing it so that we don't spread the flu, but they were very careful. They did not want to look like that people could get the flu there. But they did send the students home. For some students, that meant just moving into the community. But they did keep the SATC on campus. Many of the people that were closed out of school, teachers and students alike, volunteered their services throughout the country and in the state to help use that time to care for flu victims. Here's a picture of the Student Army Training Corps right on the Oval. Again, they're like today's ROTC. Unfortunately, although these folks were commissioned for the first time on October 1st and the flu struck Missoula on October 7th, and then the war ended, these young men were demobilized at the end of December. So the primary aspect of their short career in SATC did have to deal with influenza and scarlet fever. They didn't have barracks for the SATC on campus, so we have a picture here of tents that served as the barracks for the SATC north of Main Hall. There are reports that the SATC were quarantined in these tents. In fact, they were, but they were quarantined, and quarantine relates to those who are exposed but not yet ill, so those that you don't want then mixing in among other people who could be contagious. They were quarantined in the tents because that was their barracks. Those that became ill were isolated, and they were actually cared for in the gym at the time. During the time that the SATC was there, just to give you an example of how mighty the war effort was and how people pulled together. So during the SATC having arrived on campus and at the fort, and the flu arriving and scarlet fever, between October 1st and the middle of November, 2 barracks were built on campus for the SATC, which is quite an effort. They don't exist anymore. One was called Cook Hall, and one was called Simpkins Hall. They were named after young soldiers from the area that died in the war. They were both built north of Main Hall. There was also a hospital that was built south of Main Hall. So a great deal of resource was put into getting those up, and by the time they could move into them again, they were decommissioned. If you're familiar with campus, you probably have noticed that there is a memorial sign over by the Adams Center. It's called Memorial Row, and it's 2 lines of ponderosa trees. There's actually 32 trees planted there, and most of them still have nameplates at the bottom. Some of them don't. And so those that were in the SATC that died on campus, or students that volunteered in the war effort, or in the flu effort that died, whether it be at battle or at flu, those are the folks that are memorialized by those. In fact, one of them was a woman by the name of Mrs. Yoder. She had just arrived from Red Lodge and had come to campus to help nurse the folks on campus, and she died within days of arriving. Her tree's there, and her plaque is still in place. So this is interesting that that's memorialized. There's Mrs. Yoder's memorial. Jumping back into how the epidemic was unfolding in the larger community, again, it was just very swift. And nurses were probably the biggest shortage. Dr. Ritchie, the health officer, put out a call several times through the newspaper for caretakers to go into homes. He determined that nurses who were trained had to work in the hospitals, had to work with those who were the most ill, most at risk of dying, and that they couldn't be spared in the homes where people were just taking care of their own family members. So he would put out calls for nurses. If you know anything about caretaking and illness and flu, if you've been through the Red Cross training, please report to us so you can help others care. And the way flu hits, which is another important point for our planning, is it is going to tend to take out a whole family at once. I mean, you've had the flu in your house and you know how that happens. So mom who's trying to care for the family is going to be ill at the same time, or dad who's trying to care for the family. And that's hard enough with normal seasonal flu, but with this influenza it could result in death, and people were just prostrate. They could not care for each other. The reason I show these 2 homes is I think one of the hardest, saddest stories that I've discovered in the Missoulian in researching this history had to do with a family that lived over on the north side, and the mother was a 57-year-old woman by the name of Mrs. McClellan. She died, and her daughter had died just the night before on October 22nd, and just several hours later on October 23rd, the mother died, and then another daughter died. And then a week later, 2 more daughters died. And then the son came home from Washington. He was married to attend the funerals, and he was stricken with it and died as well. When you look at the newspaper of the time, many homes were left without mothers, sometimes without mothers or fathers. Again, it struck the age group that was raising families. The family that I mentioned, three of them are buried in St. Mary's Cemetery. I haven't been able to locate the graves of the others, and they did die. They lived next door. The family rented two houses side by side, and they died in those homes. This is a picture of some of the graves from that one family in St. Mary's, one right after the other. They simply couldn't hold funerals in the worst part of the epidemic. This family alone left 7 young children behind in the deaths that happened in the young adults in that family. So this continued on, and then it started to wane, as you saw in our graph earlier. And people thought it was over, and they thought it was over at about the same time that the war was considered over. So on Armistice Day, November 11th, this, of course, was the headline in the Daily Missoulian, and the epidemic was well on a downslope by that time. So large victory parties occurred and spontaneous parades in the street and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, that it wasn't the end of influenza, and influenza did continue to spread, and in fact it had a second upsweep. I think it's interesting to note, though, that again the war was the important issue, so quarantines, or lids as they were called, were observed in most instances, but with news like this about the war, the issue of quarantine and not spreading the disease definitely took a second seat. And the quote from the same Missoulian that we have at the top here, I think, says it: "The entire state on Armistice Day seems to have more or less disregarded during the peace celebrations all the bans on congregation that were necessary to slow spread." People felt that, it was now time to clean up, and our ads in the paper now are, get your clothing disinfected, get rid of that flu germ. It's over. People were so very elated. Unfortunately, that was the end of that first peak there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks into the epidemic, and we see that divot there the week of November 17th, and it went back up. The cases began to go up. It's not known how much of the congregating on November 11th had to do with it. I don't know that we'll know that. I can tell you that it's not unusual for a respiratory spread disease to have this exact pattern, maybe not as severe, where you have yet another wave of it. Whatever, there was another wave of it. And an immediate uptick in the number of diseases. And so all the openings of schools and churches and theaters were put on hold. And at this point, as we begin that second wave, we have a total of 1,354 cases in the city of Missoula alone, of whom 92 had died. Well, this confused everybody. It went away, it started coming back, and it appeared quarantines weren't working. They had not planned on staying under a lid this long. And every community deals with those kinds of issues in their own way. I think public health is very, very local in that regard. And I was kind of amused to read in the Daily Missoulian around this time that some neat examples of that. In a county in Idaho, for example, they formed their own militia as they started to see the second wave approach. And they did sort of a reverse quarantine. They took their guns and they stood at the border of the county, and they wouldn't let anybody, including the circuit judge, through. The judge appealed to the state attorney general, and he said, no, that county can keep you out if they want. Very interesting way. Butte, for example, had practically martial law declared over whether or not during the second wave the bars should be closed or open, and the city and the county were fighting over it, and who had that authority and whether or not they should be closed or open. And so that was really the sacred cow there. There's a good quote you'll see in a number of publications of Butte in that time, and it is not known if Butte is sick or well, open or closed, wet or dry. So that was Butte's way of dealing with it. How do you think Missoula dealt with it? I asked some folks this, and one was my daughter, and she said, Missoula, boy, they got a problem. I'm not sure they want to deal with it. We would want to have meetings, she said. And in fact, Missoula had days and days of meetings where there was a medical board appointed in addition to the health board. There was a subcommittee of the medical board, and they met for 3 days running on December 7th, 8th, and 9th in figuring out what they should or shouldn't do. By this time, in this, we had almost 400 new cases occur while these discussions were going on. The subcommittee of the medical group that was appointed in Missoula did come out with some recommendations that they should placard the houses of people that had flu, that people could go to church if they sat in every other pew. This dancing was still not allowed. They recommended that the school district hire a school nurse, and it's very interesting. This is one area where the newspaper editor parted ways with local officials because the local school superintendent did not hire a school nurse, and the newspaper editor was lambasting them for several editions about that. But the school said that children could go to school as long as they had their temperatures taken and they sprayed their throats. Doctors, I love this one. They recommended that the newspaper publish the names of those who have recovered from the flu, not just the dying. They felt that that was important to improve morale. And by this time, they said they needed to get the Army's permission to use the Fort Hospital to take care of all the flu patients. Well, by the time they got that permission, it was January, and the worst of the epidemic was over, which is another learning point or lesson for those of us in our planning, is facilities need to be identified ahead of time for something this swift. In the end, on New Year's Day, the Missoulian editorial, on a day on which 2,428 residents of the city of Missoula had been stricken with the flu, and 173 had died. On New Year's Day, the Missoulian editorial said that 1918 was a wonderful year, perhaps the most wonderful in all the world's history. Well, again, the context of the time wasn't about the flu. It was about the war. The war was over. The war was won, and it was time to look forward again. Actually, after January 1st, the flu would come back for a smaller third wave. We would end the epidemic with 2,623 cases. The schools opened in the end of December. The university started up in January, but with only half of its original enrollment. And another round of scarlet fever went around, which was actually at that point more difficult for the university and the physicians to deal with. In fact, toward the end of the flu epidemic, there were more scarlet fever cases recorded. I started out with a quote from Alfred Crosby, who's the preeminent historian on the pandemic flu. And what he says about this period of time is when the dying stopped, the forgetting began. And in fact, the 1918 influenza epidemic was largely forgotten in society until we started having concerns that a new influenza epidemic could occur. We are using that possibility to be prepared for other contagious diseases as well. We've been spared this type of contagious disease in our country for the last 80 years. But it could occur at any time. It could have been SARS. It could be some form of influenza. And I think that the lessons that we learned, even though the times were different in 1918, is that the community can pull together and can cope, and that that's the biggest goal, because we do have to remember that most of the people in the community, even in 1918, did not get the flu. And most of the people that did get the flu didn't go to the hospital. And most of the people that either went to the hospital or got the flu did not die from the flu. So it was a very tragic time, but they found a way to cope, and they left us some lessons. One of the things that we've taken from the 1918 story is what the assumptions should be for planning for a very worst case flu pandemic. And they are that we need to be prepared ahead of time, because when cases come, they will come swiftly, and the onslaught of cases will be steep. We liken it to a hill climb followed by a marathon, because the Spanish influenza did last for about 6 months. Self-reliance It's not a matter of public safety and health officials only responding, because we would have a great resource of people that weren't immediately affected who could help those that were. And in fact, some of our key responders, public safety and healthcare providers, themselves would be stricken with the flu and would need the help of others. We would not plan to use mass quarantine, although there are other types of preventing congregation that actually prevent spread of disease. And if it were truly a pandemic and a truly novel virus, we wouldn't immediately have a vaccine. And so how they handled that in 1918 provides lessons for us too. We would have to expect deaths, and we would have to expect economic losses on all fronts, not just hospitals, but personal businesses, personal incomes. We would plan that most care would take place in homes. How that would happen has not been worked out, but hospitals could not deal with a 1918 influenza epidemic in that first rush of cases. That's when we would have to help people provide care in their homes. Plus, if we're trying to isolate people who have the flu from those that don't, having them all go to one place where people are receiving care for other diseases, which may also be critical, may not be the best way to handle it. So we're looking at how can we use citizens wishing to help and citizens in their own homes for this community to cope with such a scenario. We also have to ask everyone in their place of business, particularly those that provide essential services, how would you deal with about a third of your employees being struck ill in the time of an epidemic? Even if they weren't struck ill themselves, how would you deal with their absence when they needed to be home caring for others? So the times are different, but there are a lot of good lessons that are aiding our planning here in Missoula. This is a list of all the people I want to acknowledge for helping me discover this story and find ways to show it to you. Primarily the Missoula Public Library, which keeps all of the Daily Missoulians there for any of you to go look at. And other folks, including Kurt Wilson at the Missoulian, Phil Meckling, the Missoula Historic Preservation Officer, helped me find the houses that I showed you earlier where the families lived and that were appearing in the newspaper. On and on, listed here. They all have stories. They all have things that they can share with us about how it happened then so that we can learn how to prepare for anything like this in the future. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this. If you're interested in the flu planning effort, please feel free to contact the health department. 258-4770 is my number. We also have the beginnings of our plan on our website. Just go to the Missoula County website and click into the health department webpage, and you will find communicable disease information, and you'll be able to find generic flu information, flu pandemic information, as well as the beginnings of the Missoula plan, and a good site for general knowledge of seasonal flu or pandemic flu is also easily found on the Centers for Disease Control website. Just put CDC into your search engine, it'll come up, and you'll be able to get to it quite easily. Thank you.